Hello and welcome on the Watches TV. Today we will show you something pretty different as we will discover together the largest collection of historic tools used for watchmaking I have ever seen. This fabulous private collection is the result of 40 years of passion of a great man who not only found these tools but restored them to some pretty impeccable condition. And we'll go over this with this journey with our good friend Peter Speake-Marin, because as a master watchmaker himself, he was the proper person who could explain us the purpose of these beautiful looking tools. So let's meet Peter. And I know this video is pretty long, but it's dense in meaning. So enjoy it. And considering the number of tools there, well, it could have even been much longer still. Enjoy.
Hello everybody, I'm here today with André Lechaud, who is an extraordinary individual who has spent the last 40 years restoring all of the incredible watchmaking tools that surround us today.
J'ai toujours été dans le domaine de la mécanique depuis que je me suis mis à mon compte. C'était 6 mois après la fin de l'apprentissage que je me suis mis à mon compte. Et puis là, j'ai commencé d'aller faire des visites dans les ateliers pour trouver du travail. Et parfois, je voyais aussi qu'il y avait ces petites machines qui étaient tellement jolies que je ne pouvais pas me dire elles vont passer à la casse. Alors, je les ai récupérées et puis je les ai stockées. Et c'est comme ça que je suis arrivé dans ce domaine de l'horlogerie. Mais ce n'était pas vraiment mon domaine.
Many of the tools which are here, quite often the function of them has today been forgotten or lost. And the means of manufacturing has changed so much over the last 20 years, let alone the last 100 years, that what you see today are in a sense redundant, but they are works of art and they're part of the history of watchmaking. The wheel, which has these very ornate arms, is actually very indicative of a lot of early watchmaking tools. The form did not have to be like this. It could have been a simple straight-armed wheel, but the tool was in itself a piece of art. This particular one is made from German silver, which was a material which was used in a lot of very high-quality early movements. And the function of the tool was to alter the profile on wheels. You have the cutter, which is here. The wheel would be placed between these two spindles, and then as the wheel is actually turned, the cutter would then index each individual tooth, and it would effectively file the teeth to be able to alter the profile of the teeth on the wheel. This is something which is used in restoration, but it's never really used today. But as an item, as a tool, it's a beautiful thing. So it's called a topping tool, is the English name of the piece. And usually the actual tool would then sit upon a wooden base, and inside of the base there would be a drawer, and inside of the drawer you would have a multitude of different cutters for different profiles of teeth. Wow! So this is the same tool, but it's much more rare, because this one is made in bronze. And both tools are easily 100 years old. And when they were made, well, you can imagine that they were made in a different world, in different ways than anything which is actually manufactured today. And all of the finishing that was executed on these pieces was made by hand. So this is another tool that quite often people are not familiar with it or have any understanding of actually its function. The goal of this tool is that when early watches were made, they were made in a very different system than was manufactured today. And to be able to ensure that the wheels were perpendicular between a bridge and a main plate, after a hole was actually made in the main plate to be able to locate either the jewel or the pivot hole, the bridge or the cock, which was laid on top of it, would then be centered, or the hole would be centered by aligning the two pivots, aligning the 2 points of these spindles. So the bottom spindle would then align with the bottom hole in the main plate, and then the top spindle would then come down and mark or center punch the bridge or the cock which was on top, to be able to assure the correct alignment of the hole which would then be drilled through. But somebody at some point added the feet so that it would actually then be screwed onto a bench. So no longer needing to actually have that square boss. Now, it's a simple thing, but again, it's beautiful. And somebody took a lot of time to modify it. And not only to execute it in a way which was functional, but in a way which is actually aesthetically very, very beautiful. So this is another tool that would have found started off its life in a factory, probably somewhere between 60 to 100 years ago. Exactly, I have no idea. Andre has restored it beautifully. He has stripped the whole thing down, polished all the different surfaces. The handles and a lot of the levers are made in bronze. But when this was first made, they would probably have been actually painted. You wouldn't have actually seen that color, that material. The function, it would have been driven, it was a drill or different forms of cutters, driven by these rollers here. You have a drill here, held in place by the spindle at the top. It would have been something which would have been used in series for multiple uses. And at the back here, this element has been added at some point, which would have been connected to a reservoir of oil to be able to keep whatever was being cut lubricated. So this was made by Henry Hauser, who is stamped on the plaque which is here. It's a lathe which would have been used for multiple functions. It's kind of a precursor to CNC in the sense that you would have multiple tools. Here you have 2 tools to be able to adapt. So you have different size cutters and you could perform different functions without actually moving or changing the tooling or moving the part from one lathe to another one. The actual tool would have been manually used. You actually have a tool rest here for manual manipulation with a graver, and then you could move the piece up, it would index, and then you could actually drill or place an angle on a piece, and then on the lower section you could again drill, or there would be some other kind of cutter. And there would be an indexing system to ensure that the position of the tools would each time be concentric with the center of the rotating axe. So the next thing to show is an essential, or was an essential in early workshops, would be a dividing head. This tool would be used to actually cut the teeth on a blank to produce a wheel. The wheel itself would have been placed on a support in the center. The cutter, which actually cuts the teeth, would have been this disc, which is rotating, being driven by a pulley here from an external power source. The number of holes on the dividing disc at the bottom are associated with one tooth in the circumference of the blank of the wheel, and the disc moved one hole at a time to be able to index the number of teeth required on that blank being cut by that cutter. These were all different means to be able to mechanically adjust the position of the cutter, of the wheel, the friction, the tension within the piece, so that when the wheel was actually cut, all of the teeth were perfectly aligned. They would be complete concentricity running around the final wheel. However, if you take this tool, it is exactly the same tool, but the dividing plate has far fewer holes which are drilled into it. So this would have either been used for making wheels with far fewer teeth or even pinions. And the blank to make the wheel or pinion would have been fixed here. And then you have the cutter, which would have been set in this section. and then this would have been turned by a pulley system driven from here and then going to an external power source. The key function of this particular tool, which was held in place by a vise holding it at the bottom, was to burnish the pivots on wheels and other arbors. It could be a balance staff, by example. The pivot, one pivot would actually be held inside this section here, at the end of this spindle. And the other pivot would lay in a small cutout on this piece. And each of those cutouts is slightly different, hundredths of a millimeter in difference, indexed by the back of the spindle, which is here. So you can move this out, rotate it round to the appropriate diameter that was required. And then the pivot would then rest in this hard metal tool at the end. And then by using a burnisher, which would sometimes be have a flat edge, a sharp edge, a right-angled edge, other times would be slightly rounded if it was a balance staff, would then push down on that pivot, and then the bow would then power the balance staff or the pinion or the wheel to be able to actually drive it. And then the actual burnisher would then push down on the flats of the pivots to be able to burnish them, which would then make them harder and polished. And then once the flats were done, the spindle would be turned around, and then on the other side you have a disc, and in the disc you have different holes at different diameters. This would allow the pivot to be able to traverse the hole, and then the arbor would then be turned with the bow, powered by the bow, and then there would be another form of burnisher that would then round, polish, and harden the end of the pivot. To finish, this is a topping tool, like the others that I've just shown you on the wall. But this one is complete with the lower box. The lower box would often have all of the different cutters. These are the different supports which would associate to the different sides of the wheels. So you have different cutaways, and they would often be modified in relation to the size of the different wheels. There are the tools, which would have been associated with the machine, which is specialized to be able to tighten up the different cutters. And all these little discs, these are the different cutters, which would have been associated with the different profiles of each style of tooth. And this section at the top, which is cut away, forms a spring. It continues to be serrated until the very end. And then as the disc does a complete 360, the edge, which is finer than the rest of the file, the filed surface, will then index the next tooth and continue the process so that each tooth would actually have the same amount of material removed from it, so the profile of the tooth would then be changed. So I'm just going to very quickly go through a few other small tools, most of which today are actually forgotten, okay, but I think actually very interesting at the same time. This is one of them. This, when you show to most people, will have no idea of its original function. And the reason for that is that it was a tool which became redundant with the moment that pocket watches really went out of fashion. The way it works is that, as with many of the other tools, the base, which is here, would have been held inside of a vise. But the actual function was associated with pocket watches. Now, on early pocket watches, on all pocket watches, you'll have a bow that goes around the crown. So you have the crown which winds up the watch, and around the crown you will have a bow which you would then use to attach your chain. Now, on the bow there would have been two effectively pivots at the bottom of the bow, which in turn would have then clipped onto the tube, which then holds the bow in place. And the end of the end form of the bow had to be in a particular shape. And that is what this tool does. Here on this dividing plate that goes around. So it's not a dividing plate, it's a plate holding multiple different forms of cutter, which can then, by removing this pin on the outside, can then be rotated, and all of those cutters will then mesh with this wheel, which is then driven by this handle. So you select the cutter that you wish, that you need for your bow, and once you've selected it, you hold it in place by pinning it. Hold the bow between the rear end of this piece and the cutter, and then by turning the handle, the cutter would then cut a pivot into the inside of the bow. But even the box that the piece was originally sold with, that was made in, that it was kept in, was silk on the inside and really quite a beautiful item. And then the whole piece is held securely inside. This is a tool which was used to be able to actually increase the friction on a cannon pinion. And the cannon pinion is the part of the watch that the minute hand is usually pushed onto. And the cannon pinion usually has a friction fit onto the center wheel. And the way the friction was added, and this is not necessarily the case today, but it's the way that it used to be done, was in the center of the cannon pinion there was a nick, there was a compression made. And here is a tool that was used to adapt that. The actual cannon pinion would be placed in between these two jaws. The screw behind here would control the position of it so that it would rest in one place. And then the watchmaker would support the cannon pinion carefully in place, and then drop the top punch down, and then gently tap on the top. And then that is the way that you would actually increase the friction on the cannon pinion. Now this is interesting because when I first looked at this piece, I asked Andre what it was, and he wasn't actually sure about it. But he spent quite a few hours actually to dismantle it, to polish it, to return it to its original former glory. And what it actually is for holding balances, so that either the screw on early balances could be removed, or on a more modern balance, that material could be removed from the edge of the balance. So the lower level, the lower shelf here could be adjusted and moved up and down. And then that could potentially be where a balance cock would actually sit. And then the balance wheel would then sit flat against this base here. Depending on the size, you would choose which of the different supports. And then this piece would then come over and then hold the wheel in place, so that you could then either remove the screw or remove material from the top. This is again a manually powered form of, in English, a lathe in essence. The wheel, with again this beautiful form, which you find on the topping tools and many other tools of the same period. Okay, this is what it powers the main drive plate, which is here. The plate, this section here, with the three jaws, is where you would have actually placed most likely a large bridge or the main plate of a watch. So the jaws would have then been tightened down by these knobs. The central axe, which you have here, which traverses the center, controlled by this small spring-loaded button underneath these, would have then located the point which you wanted to make the center of what you're about to work on. That doesn't mean the center of the actual main plate, because you may have been wanting to machine or work something which was eccentered. So this is the way to actually center whatever you're actually working on, held in place. And then afterwards you have different ways of actually working that main plate. It could have been simply with this tool rest, and you have your engraver on top, a tool like this, which would have then been working onto the main material, which would then be removing material from the main plate. Or alternatively, you have a tailstock, and there would be a tool placed in here, and then this would have moved further in, and then you would adjust using the different regulation knobs around the machine to be able to alter the position of this, and then going in and out to be able to adjust the amount of material that you wanted to remove from the main plate. So another tool which is in Andre's collection is an early vibrating tool. The function of this particular tool was to be able to adjust the length of a balance spring when the watch was first made, so that it would actually be close to the correct vibrational length that the watch was going to vibrate at. And the way that was done was there was a balance underneath which had already been adjusted to the correct vibration. This one was at a frequency of 18,000. And then the actual new balance spring and wheel would be held, or the balance spring would be held between these two drawers at the top, and then lowered down, and then the length of the balance spring would be adjusted shorter or longer between these two drawers until the new balance, which is on top of this glass plate, was actually vibrating at the same speed as the balance which is underneath it. André Lechaud has spent a large part of the last 40 years restoring all of these incredible tools that are surrounding us here today. They are representative of a period in watchmaking that is long gone. And the reason why he has done this is that he wanted to preserve this equipment. He wanted to make sure that it wasn't forgotten, that it wasn't lost, which is what I mentioned at the beginning. But what I can't emphasize is the amount of time that he has spent, the detail that has gone into these restorations of the history that is in this room. The value of the items in this room is between everything and nothing, is priceless. To some people, like myself, there is no price to put on these tools, or the time that he has actually placed into them to preserve them. On the other hand, they're very obscure. So the number of people who actually appreciate them is so small, their value is rather obscure. But the intrinsic value that is surrounding us is absolutely extraordinary. The tools have been restored lovingly and with care. And the same tools were used lovingly and with care when they were actually made, when they were being employed for the functions that they were executing. Sometimes 50 years ago, sometimes nearly 200 years ago. It's all about the people and the time that goes into making the watches and the tools which were behind the watches.
Thanks for watching. A huge thank you to Mr. Lechaud to have let us film his private collection and share it with you. I hope you discovered some pretty interesting stuff there. See you real soon, and beware watchmaking and the great people behind it. See you.